In this section, we will continue to prep our pieces by cutting holes in the chipboard and also the matching pattern paper, and then prepping the chipboard for construction. You need the template sets, and then eventually you'll need each of the packets. So for building one, you may recall all four sides are exactly the same. We're just going to make this cut on one of the four sides. So I'm going to get out one of those chipboard sides and one of the pieces of pattern paper from my baggie number 1. We'll start with the chipboard, so I'll just put my pattern paper aside for a moment. And then let me zoom in here a little so you can see this a little better. So our first measurement is a 1/2 inch in on the side, and I like to work on my mat. This, you can use a pencil or whatever you can see. This is a friction erasable pen that I have here, and apologize for any glare on the ruler. I just line up my ruler on the 1/2 inch and draw a line, and then it's easier for me to work from left to right, so I'll just turn it upside down to mark the other 1/2 inch line. And then coming up from the bottom, we have 3/4 of an inch, so I'll turn this way. Measure that 3/4. And then the next measurement up is 3 1/4. So I have a 1/4 left right here. And then 1, 2, 3, and I have my marking accomplished. So now that I have my lines marked, I'm going to mark down here at the bottom that this is the front of this piece, and then I'm also going to mark in the middle space that we're going to cut out one front panel, just in case it gets separated, because note here that we save the chipboard cutout to use for the back of the opening. That saves us some cutting here. So I'm going to cut, and when I cut, I won't cut on the lines. I'm going to use those as guidelines to know where to cut, but I'll again align up my ruler on the craft mat using the markings on the craft mat and cut that with my knife. And it's okay to go a little bit past the opening so you get a good cut, but just come along and cut first the horizontal lines, and then I'll change direction and cut my 2 vertical lines again, cutting a 1/2 inch in on one side, flipping it around and cutting the 1/2 inch in from the other. It's important to make these cuts as accurate as possible. So now I have my cutting accomplished, and I have the panel that came out of the center and my actual side piece. I'm going to put that side piece aside for a moment and do a little work on this front panel. Anytime we have a panel that we cut out, we have to do a little trimming. And when it's a rectangle, we can trim it just on 2 sides. The basic plan is that it will be a 1/16 of an inch smaller on all 4 sides. But since it's a rectangle, we can just do that by cutting off 1/8 of an inch on 2 sides. And I always mark the 2 sides I'm going to cut. It doesn't matter which 2, you can choose any 2 adjacent sides, but that way I know if I make a little mark here and then my mark is gone, if I get interrupted, I know what I have already cut. So I'm going to just line that right edge up on my craft mat and take my little ruler here and line up 1/8 of an inch here and here so that I can trim off 1/8 of an inch right there. And if you can always draw this line and then cut that with a metal edged ruler if you want. So I'll cut the 2 edges on my panel. And once I have that trimming accomplished, I'll also write the word trimmed on here just so I remember that it's already done. And now I can put that panel back in my baggie. So now going back to the chipboard, and I've also pulled out the piece of decorative paper, I'm going to attach the wrong side of the decorative paper to the front of this shape. And this just makes it easier to mark what you need to cut out here. So I'm just going to run my pen along the inside of those lines, or you can use a pencil, whatever shows up. And we're basically cutting this to be the same measurements we used in the template, so you can refer to the template as you go along. But this way you don't have to do all of that measuring to begin with. I'll still line that up on my craft mat and cut the lines just like I did for the chipboard. So now I've cut out the pattern paper. This piece that came out of the center can go with our other scraps. We do not need it. And the shape that we cut out of the pattern paper can go back in our baggie. For our next steps, we need all of the sides of the building. And I've just prepared my surface with a piece of patty paper here, just because I'm going to do some inking. And this marker matches my finishing strips. And this step is we're going to just put about 1/4 of an inch, at least 1/8 of an inch, on the top and the bottom of all 4 of the sides. And that's just so that when we put our finishing strips on, we will not have to put one on the top and the bottom. You, of course, can choose to finish the top and the bottom, but it will require more paper and more time to do so. And you only ever see about 1/16 of an inch is revealed, and so I feel that that is not enough to warrant having to finish those edges. If you disagree, of course, it's your project, so do it however you'd like. So I'm just taking my marker, this marker, I've tested it, and it matches my dark finishing strips, so I'll run a line on the top and the bottom of each panel. Our last step in preparing these wall sides is to turn them all over. So we're looking at the sides without any ink on them. And we're going to add a joining strip to the left side of each one of these panels. So I'm just taking one of my joining strips. They're the ones with the score tape on the outside. I will measure them to length. And then I like to cut that back at a slight angle on each end. And then remove one of the score tape backings and put that right on the edge of the panel. Don't remove the other score tape backing, and don't join the panels together. When you accomplish this, you'll have some scraps which we will use in our next steps, so just make sure to save all of your little scraps. And whenever you make any joins, use your bone folder to burnish that tape in position. And now we can just take these 4 sides and put them back in our baggie, and that finishes the prep for building 1. The prep for the side walls for building 2 is very simple because there is no opening to cut. So I just have all 4 of the side walls here in front of me. And again, I will ink on the bottom and the top edge of each one of these, and then flip them over after the inking is accomplished, and prep them with one joining strip along their left edge. And you may think that these scraps, they're about an inch, will be too small, but you will use them, so go ahead and save those scraps as well. So here are my 4 sides for building 2 all prepped. I can put them back in the baggie. We will cut the paper, the pattern paper for this building at a later time. Next we'll work on building 3. I have the template here for building 3. I'm going to pull out the 2 wide pieces, the 2 wide walls, and one of the narrow walls of the chipboard, and then I'll just pull out the 2 pattern papers for the wide walls. So I won't need the pattern paper for a moment, so I'll put that aside. And I'm going to start with the narrow wall. The only thing we have to do here is mark and punch a 1/8 inch hole, and our instructions say that we will measure in 3/8 of an inch from the right side and down 5/8 of an inch from the top. Make a cross there, and then make sure you use the 1/8 inch hole on your punch to punch that hole. So 3/8 in from the right side, 5/8 in from the top. And once you've made this hole, you can either set this aside or put it back in the baggie. Now let's turn our attention to the wide sides and we'll work with the chipboard first. The first thing we're going to do is look here at the top. It says cut 1 with the gable plus the openings and cut 1 with the gable only. So let's start by doing the gables on both of these. And this line on the left tells us our gable measurements, and the first thing we'll do is measure down 1 1/4 inches on both pieces and mark a horizontal line. So 1 1/4 inches down on both pieces. So I just turn this on my mat, measure in 1 1/4 inches, and draw a line. Once I have that horizontal line drawn, my template calls for me to find center. So I'm going to turn this around. This is a 4-inch wide piece, so center's at 2 inches. I'll just mark a tick mark there. And then I can cut from this tick mark to the intersection of the line on either side. So just cut 2 triangles off. And then I'll repeat that same process on my other side. Now I've zoomed in here to show you the technique I use for cutting these triangles, and that is to take the point of my craft knife and put it at the end of where I want to go. And I'm just pushing it in a little bit there. And then I can bring my ruler up and line it up with this point up here that I want to start at. And that way I get a good cut across there, and I can repeat that for the other side. So now I have my gables cut on both. That's all I need for one, so I'll put it aside, and then I'll turn my attention to marking the 2 openings on this piece. So again, they're 1/2 inch in on both sides, so I'll start by marking a 1/2 inch in on both sides. Now I have my 2 1/2 inch vertical lines drawn. I can turn my attention to the horizontal lines, and the first ones that we have down here is 3/4 of an inch, and then 1 1/8 inches up from that. So again, I'll use my craft mat and mark the 3/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to come up 1 1/8 inches from that line. And I'm just using, this time I'm using the ruler on my line I just drew, plus I'm using my ruler on my craft mat. Sorry, got a little bit of a glare there. There, I think you can see what's happening. So that'll give me the 1 1/8 inches. And I always mark these lines a little long. And then the next measurement up is 1/2 inch. So from this line we just drew, 1/2 inch. Now from this line we just drew, it's 3 3/8 up to the corner points here. And sometimes for these kind of odd measurements, I find it easier just to measure them out using a ruler. Just get one side, shift this down a little bit. So I measured 3 3/8 up to here, and I'll keep this aligned on my craft mat. And then I can transfer that marking over to the other side. Those are just tick marks to mark these two, to mark where these two corners will go. Then we need to measure up for this one, which is 1 inch above that. So if we have this on our craft mat, we can measure 1 inch up from where we just made those tick marks. Then once we have this marked, we can find the center point by putting this on our craft mat. This piece is 4 inches wide, so at 2 inches, you can mark that center, and that will be this top point here. And if you want to, you can connect those dots just so you know where you're going. So there's a lot of extra lines on here, so before I start cutting, I get rid of extra lines so I don't get confused about where I want to cut. I'm not going to cut in here or here. So now that I have my lines marked, before I cut them, I'm going to write on my panel like we did before, or on my side like we did before, the building number and the word front. And then I'll put 3 top panel on this one and 3 bottom panel on this one. So now I can cut. I will use these as guidelines. I will turn this on its side and do my horizontal cuts first using the lines on my craft mat and the measurements from the template. These just give me an idea of where I'm going, and mostly it's because of the thickness of your pencil or pen. And yeah, so, and then when I get up here, I will connect these dots with my craft knife and cut that gable. So now I have my 2 panels cut out. I'll put my frame aside for a second, and on these we again need to do a little bit of trimming. On the one here that has a gable, I'll make a little mark on all 5 of their sides so that I'll know which ones I've cut off. And on the bottom one, I'll just do 2 sides. Let's start with the bottom one because we're familiar with how to do that. It's a rectangle, so we'll cut 1/8 of an inch off of the 2 marked sides. And so I'll get that accomplished. So I've trimmed my 2 sides, and I wrote trimmed on there so I would remember. And for the top panel, we're going to cut 1/16 of an inch off of each one of these edges. And the best way to do that is to line up an edge along a line on your craft mat, and then you can take your ruler and hold it up so that the 1/16 of an inch mark on the ruler is on the 1 inch mark on your craft mat, and then when you trim that, you'll get an accurate 1/16 of an inch off, and do that for all 5 sides. So here is my top panel now that I've trimmed all the sides, and I wrote trimmed on it, and I can take these 2 panels and put them back in my baggie. Now we're ready to prep pattern paper, and I'm going to start with the simpler side, the side without openings, and I'll just use some temporary adhesive and attach the pattern paper wrong side down to the front of this, and then turn it over. And I'm just going to use my craft knife right along those gable ends, or you can draw a line and do it, without the chipboard. Either way. And when I pull this paper off, I'm going to write outside on here just so I know which side. It shouldn't matter. Everything was cut symmetrically. So I'll put this piece aside and that piece aside. And now I'll take this piece and again use some temporary adhesive. Attach the wrong side to the front of that chipboard. So I'm going to use my craft knife on the gable ends, but for the inside I will mark my shapes and then refer to my template to get those shapes cut out. So these two pieces are scraps and can go back with all your other scraps, and then we can take these two pieces and put them back in our baggie. Now I have all 4 pieces of chipboard out here because I'm ready to do some inking and then add joining strips. The first thing I want to do is to erase any lines that might be within that 1/4 inch of inking that I'm going to do. Even if it's pencil, sometimes it will show up underneath the inking. It may not be very visible, but I just like to do that. And then make sure on the side that we punch the hole, the outside is the side where the hole is in 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to erase that, but I have that side sitting up so that I know to ink on that right side. And I just wrote these very close to the edge, so I'll erase those as well. So I'll go ahead and ink, and then on these we ink all the bottoms, of course, and the tops on the rectangle ones, and on the ones with the gable, ink both of the gables. Now we can flip all of these over to the non-ink side and add a joining strip on the left side of each one. Don't forget to burnish each one of those strips and then put these into baggie number 3, and that prep will be completed. For building 4, I have the template out here. We only have cutting to do on one wide side, so I've gotten out one wide side of chipboard and one wide side of patterned paper. The marking for this one is pretty straightforward. We do have 2 openings, but they are both rectangles. So I'll start by making my 1/2 inch lines on either side. And once I have those 1/2 inch lines, I can transfer my other markings in turn going up the vertical side. I've marked my 3/4 here, and then to do my 3 5/8, which is next here, I'm going to measure on one side 3 5/8. Now that I have that tick mark, I can transfer that to the other side and make that mark, and then I'll just continue up with my other 2 marks. Before I cut, I'll erase any extraneous lines so I know for sure where I'm cutting. This is 4, and I'll mark 4 front down here on the bottom. I'm also going to write the word top up here. It's just sometimes this piece, because it has such a big open top area, it's easy to get confused, so I just like to write the word top up there. And then on each of these openings, I'll write for top panel and for bottom panel. And then I can go ahead and cut those openings out. So now I have my frame cut out here, and again I'll put this piece aside and we have to do some trimming, and I'll trim 1/8 of an inch off of both of these panels. I've marked both panels as trimmed and I'll put them in my baggie. Next, I'll cut the openings in my decorative paper by temporarily adhering it to the front side of the side wall. On this building, the black with red plaid is going to be showing. So I'll mark and cut the openings. And now these pieces can go in with my other scraps, and this piece can go back in the number 4 baggie. And then our final step is to ink on the bottom and the top of each of the chipboard side pieces, flip them over and add our joining strips and reserve the scraps. So here are the 4 sides for building 4. They are all prepped and I can put them in the baggie, and that completes the building 4 prep. I have the template for building 6 here, and it's baggy. And for building 6, the wide sides, the wide sides are 3.5 inches. The narrow sides are 3 inches. So don't get confused. Make sure when you're cutting a template that you get the one that is the correct size here, the 3.5 inch one. And we need both wide sides to begin with because we need to cut a gable end on both. And I've also pulled out the pattern paper. So I'll set the pattern paper aside for now and mark my gables, which we mark a line 1 inch down and then a center point. So I'll do that. To find center, you can either use a centering ruler, or I just like to put it on my craft mat, and then I can use my long ruler right down the center and find that top center point. And I'll cut the 2 gable triangles off just like I did before. So I can put one of these to the side, and then I'll mark my openings using the measurements that are listed here, just like we've done before. So I've made my marks and I've labeled my panels and the front of my side wall here. And again, I'll erase any extraneous lines so I don't get confused about what I need to actually cut. And I'll go ahead and cut those 2 openings. So now I have my openings cut, and since these are rectangular panels, I can trim them, and I'll trim 1/8 of an inch off of 2 adjacent sides. And the 2 trimmed panels can go back in the number 6 baggie. Now we can cut our decorative paper. On the side with no openings, we just need to cut off the gable ends. And the snowflake side is the outside for this building. And then for the side with the openings, we'll again put some temporary adhesive and put the other decorative panel on top. Cut off the gable ends with a craft knife and then mark and cut for the openings. So our decorative paper can go back in the baggie. So now all that's left to do is to ink the top and bottom edges on all 4 chipboard sides. Remember, we'll do both angles on gable ends, and then flip them over and add a joining strip on each left side. And here are the sides for building 6 all prepped. Remember to save even these small pieces of joining strip. So for building 7, I have the template here, and on the wide side we'll cut openings in one of the panels, and on the narrow sides that's where the gable is going to go, so we need both of those chipboard pieces out, and I'll get their corresponding pieces of pattern paper out as well. So I have my pieces out, and I'll put my decorative paper aside for now, and I think I'll start on my narrow sides. So the narrow sides each have a gable end, but before we cut that gable we want to measure and punch at a 1/8 inch hole in just one of the sides, and that hole is measured by coming down 7/8 of an inch and then finding center. So I'll go ahead and mark for that. So here's my mark for the hole. It's 7/8 of an inch down from the top and centered left and right. Again, it's a 1/8 inch hole, so I'll go ahead and punch that. Now that I have that hole punched, on both of my narrow sides I can measure and cut my gable. The sides of the gable, if you look on this side, the sides of the gable are 1 inch down. So if you drew this 7/8 inch line and it went all the way across, make sure you erase it so that you don't get confused for doing the gable. So measure down 1 inch, and then after you've measured 1 inch, connect to center and cut off the 2 triangles to make the gable ends. So here are my 2 gables cut in my narrow sides, and I can put those to the side for now. And this is one of my wide sides, and I'll go ahead and mark my 1/2 inch lines on either side, and I'll mark a center line that comes down 1.5 inches or so from the top. And you can see this is a 4 inch wide piece, so that center line would be at 2 inches. So now that I have those 3 lines drawn, I can turn it on its side and do some measuring. I'll come up 3/4 of an inch, then 2 5/8, and then I'll make this 1/2 inch line. So I have those 3 lines drawn, and then the next thing we need to do is make some tick marks on the outside lines that are 1 1/8 up from that 1/2 inch line, and that would be at the 5 inch mark. So I'll just make a couple of little tick marks there, here and here, and then from there I'll measure 7/8 of an inch up. And when I make the 7/8 inch mark, it only needs to go on the center line right there. And then I can connect that center mark with a tick mark on either side to make the gable opening. So I'll erase my extraneous lines. I'll mark my 2 panels and building 7 front here, and then go ahead and get those openings cut. Once we have our openings cut and our panels, we can put the frame aside for a moment, and on the rectangle we can cut 1/8 of an inch off of 2 sides, and on the panel that has a gable end we'll cut 1/16 of an inch off of all 5 sides. So 1/16 of an inch off of all 5 sides on this panel, and 1/8 of an inch off of 2 adjacent sides on the rectangle. Once they're trimmed, I wrote the word trimmed on each one, and I can put them in the baggie. Now we can do some trimming on our decorative paper. I'll start with the 2 narrow sides where all we have to do is trim the gables and just put them on with some temporary adhesive. The flowers part is going to show for this building. And I'll just use my craft knife and cut the two gable ends on this panel and on the other narrow panel. They should both be the same, but if you're concerned about that, you can write a letter designation on each one so that you know which one goes with which, but if you cut accurately, you won't have an issue with that. And then lastly, we can put some temporary adhesive on our side with the openings and put that decorative paper on and trace and cut out the openings on that side. And now we can put our decorative paper back in the baggie and our scraps in with our other scraps. Now it's time to do some inking. We'll ink the bottom edges, the top edges, and both gable edges as we've done before. Then flip them over and add a joining strip to the left side of each piece. And after burnishing, you can put these pieces in the number 7 bag. And last we have building 8. There is, of course, building 8A, the annex, but we'll work on that later. And for this one is very similar to building 7. We're going to cut gable in the narrow pieces, so we need both narrow pieces of chipboard out and one of the wide pieces of chipboard to begin with, and then both of the narrow pieces of decorative paper and one piece of the wide piece of decorative paper. So I'll put the decorative paper aside to begin with, and I'm going to cut the gables on the narrow sides. We're measuring down 1 inch, finding center, and cutting off the 2 triangles to make the gable ends. Next we can work on our wide side, and there's one thing that's a little different on this one is that the left side is 1/2 inch, but the right side is 1 1/4 inches. So I'll make those 2 vertical lines to start with. And once I have the vertical lines, I can turn it on its side and measure up 3/4, and from there a 3 1/2. Now that I have it marked, I will do my writing as usual for the front and the panel, and then I can go ahead and make my cuts. Now that we have our panel cut out, since it's a rectangle, we can cut 1/8 of an inch off of 2 sides, so I'll go ahead and do that. Now we can cut our decorative paper, and I'm going to make sure I have mine all lined up so that plaid is going in at the same location all the way across. I think you can see that, and that way I think it'll look a little nicer. It's not critical. And so I'll first put them on with temporary adhesive on the narrow gables and cut the gable ends, and then put the wide side onto the front with temporary adhesive and mark and cut that opening. Now remember, when you're cutting on the front panel here, that it is not symmetrical. So if you're working on this from the reverse side, so that means that on the left you'll have the 1 1/4 inches, and on the right you'll have the 1/2 inch. So I've moved my ruler over here 1 1/4 inches to cut that line, and then I can cut the 1/2 inch on this side. So we can put our pattern paper in the baggie and the scrap in with our other scraps. And then, as usual, our last step is to ink the bottom and the top, including the 2 gable edges. Then flip them over and add a joining strip on the left side of each panel. And after burnishing, that completes the prep for building 8.